Now, the conflict in Ukraine might have a disastrous impact on certain African countries, damaging their economies and pressuring governments to take sides in the expanding conflict between Russia and Western powers. South Africa is an important ally in Africa, and the two nations have strong economic links since both are members of BRICS, a collection of growing economies throughout the world. To unpack the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the African continent, we are now joined by Advocate Sipho Mantula, who's a researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. Advocate Mantula, always a pleasure to speak to you. Now, we have already seen the effects that this conflict is having in South Africa, where now we are seeing the petrol price going up. But what other effect could we possibly see specifically in other African countries?
Jumbo, Africa, and to the viewers, I think this is a very important issue that we are focusing this afternoon, looking at the effect and the impact of this conflict. But remember that if you look at the loss of war, there are some principles that we have to look into. One of the impact in the African continent will be developmental aid that will be stifling some of the changes. The military peacekeeping missions that have been in the African continent. Africa is currently having conflict in the Sahel region, a conflict that we see in Mozambique, our neighbor, a conflict that we see as well in Ethiopia. And we've seen how Russia has been playing its role, not as a former colonizer, but Russia has been very, one can say, critical in the African continent. And as we have alluded about our role, one impact is our young people who are trapped in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And we are talking of young people coming from countries like Morocco, countries like Ghana, countries like Lagos, and as well as our own young people who are there. So that impact will have to be understood in the sense that what Russia is going through is what you can call pacification, a cleansing process that Russia has been engaged since the 1970s and the 1990s on the Soviet Union question. But it is critical that Africa is meeting with Russia towards the end of the year. And that's how we should be looking at what is the impact as well as the effect when there are some internal conflicts between neighbors. Because one aspect is that some of the analysts are not aware that Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine currently is aligned to the NATO and to the EU forces. And that's where it is some of the crisis that happens if Africa is finding itself taking sides. I heard our minister, I heard South Africa raising their views, but we have not yet got an AU position, despite the members of the AU who are in the Peace and Security Council of the UN, who have already taken sides earlier. I see them as a premature decisions that Kenya, Gabon, as well as Ghana, they have taken on this crisis.
And now we talk, of course, you've mentioned the issue of what is happening there and how it's going to affect Africa partially. But what happens to the ordinary South African or African person at this stage? You've mentioned the students that are in Ukraine or Russia, but what happens in Africa to the ordinary person right now?
You know, we'll talk about this price of oil, but there is a price of bread and the grain and the rice that the North African countries have been relying on Ukraine. When you look at it, so that goes to your socio-economic basics. The other impact on an ordinary person is the overload of information, the bombardment that the Western media is giving ordinary people about this current conflict. And once the ordinary people don't understand that World War I, World War II, when they happened, most of the African countries were dragged into a war that they never knew what was that war all about. So for an ordinary person, he must ask, are we going to a new Cold War or a new hot war? And Africa definitely will suffer the consequences. And I've mentioned those issues that of developmental aid, the issues of conflict resolution that Russia has been assisting in the Sahel region. Russia is part of the UN Security Council. So for an ordinary person, what comes to is a civilian. All those civilians who are affected in the conflict, the loss of war, the international law, talks about a principle of the separation, to draw a line, the distinction. The other principle that is critical is the unnecessary suffering. It means ordinary people will suffer the consequences of a conflict that has come out of the heads of states as well as members of parliament. And that's how you feel that Russia has taken a clear move on this issue of Ukraine for many years. But it's only people are now rising up and turning up and say, but how does this conflict affect ordinary people? It affects them on their pockets. It affects them on the mind control, the overload of the information that comes from Western media by labeling Russia as if Russia is the wrong player in this crisis.
Do you think, Advocate Mantula, that this is why we are now sitting in South Africa specifically, where we've heard DIRCO Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor making her stance, and then the President coming back to say that he's unhappy about that stance? Do you think that's now we seem to be sitting on the fence when it comes to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, mainly because we are part of the BRICS body and so is Russia?
So like I said earlier, the premature diplomatic statements, or what they call note verbals, have to be sanitized with an African knowledge before. And secondly, if you look at we have an embassy in Kyiv, by the way. We have an ambassador there. So he will give us the reports which have been going on in terms of the occupation of the eastern part of Ukraine all along. But for our ministry to punt that we need to have a peaceful dialogue, yes, that is a common language that diplomats use. But what is important is to not find ourselves being embroiled in a conflict that we have never been invited to. And we invite ourselves. Because what has happened in this country is that for the past 10 years, we have lost our impact in the international fora. We had an influence in many crises, your Iraq and Iran conflict, your Somalian crisis, many conflicts. But it appears that our diplomats, they rush to the Twitter, they rush to the social media without understanding that this is an international conflict that has an implication, repercussion for the whole continent. And it is important what you type when you get into those Twitter space as a diplomat. And that's how I will assume that maybe President Ramaphosa, being aware that we play a role as well in the AU Peace and Security Council, we play a role in the SADC region on the conflict in Mozambique, we play a role in the Sahel region conflict. So we have to be very mindful when we are engaging on this current crisis of Ukraine and Russia, which, like I said earlier, it appears to be revival of the Soviet and the communism crisis that happened during the time of Boris Yeltsin and many leaders of Russia who came before Vladimir Putin.
Advocate Mantula, what do you think about NATO's strategy of neo-colonialism in this conflict?
So in international law, if we have to understand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we have to understand it was a force that was established to counter what they used to label Russian communism. So NATO, in some instance, you can see it as a antithesis of the United Nations Security Council. For us, as we think in an international law, we don't see NATO also as a neo-colonial power, but we see it as it has taken sides. And Ukraine, some of the analysts are saying Ukraine should have applied the principle of non-alignment. They should not have aligned themselves with NATO or with EU and with other forces. Because their problem is that with Russia, if I can be honest with you, they are the people of the same ethnic group, same language, same culture. If you can understand that Ukraine and Russia, it was once a same territory. It's only when there was the separation and the referendum that happened in the early 1990s. That's what it causes, all this friction of the appetite of NATO. And NATO, as you know, their language is always military precision, it's always military attacks on Russia, even if they are trying to use sanctions. Sanctions, in this instance, they won't work because Russia are ahead of their game.
What do you make, Advocate Mantula, of the media coverage between the Western and Eastern media when it comes to this situation?
So again, international law reminds us the media plays a critical role when there is a conflict or it's an armed conflict. Media becomes either the victim or it becomes the peddler of a misinformation and a disinformation. And at the same time, you find that even how the media reports this conflict, whether it's blow by blow, the main person is a viewer, is a listener, is a reader. What does the reader and a viewer and a listener grasp out of that? But you find that the Western media is again being found wanting to be siding with NATO and the EU, siding with the US, with Britain. And Russia, it has even went to extend to limit their social media conversation on this conflict because they are aware that this is a regional security operation, that when they talk about militarization and other aspects of dealing with the Ukraine national question. So the role of media in some instance, you sometimes, like I've said, you find them as peddlers of misinformation.
That is Advocate Sipho Mantula. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.